So my point is, this is pure American stupidity. Okay, we are governed by arrogance and ignorance. We are effusive in praise for ourselves. We see ourselves in unrealistic ways. All you have to do is listen to President Trump. If they're not going to do what I say, if they're not going to come together, well, then I'm not going to have anything to do with this. We'll walk away. Who the hell does he think he is?
大家好，我是老吴。今天我们要聊的这位嘉宾，在 YouTube 的西方观众圈里非常火，他就是美国退役陆军上校道格拉斯·麦格雷格。麦格雷格上校的经历相当丰富，他曾参与海湾战争，亲自指挥过坦克作战，担任过欧洲盟军最高司令部联合行动中心的主任。他还写过一本书，主张对陆军进行彻底改革。退役后，他还当过美国国防部长的高级顾问。麦格雷格上校在政治和外交政策上主张非干预主义，强调美国应该克制，不要到处出手。他常批评北约，也反对美国和北约持续对乌克兰提供武器，这些观点引起不少争议。接下来这段内容中，他对美国目前的全球战略和内部问题做了非常犀利的剖析。他会谈到为什么他认为华盛顿根本没有战略，只是死守一个早就撑不下去的全球霸权。为什么他觉得美国精英活在幻想岛里，对自身实力和世界局势严重误判，以及这种傲慢与无知可能会给欧洲盟友带来什么样的危机。接下来就让我们一起来听听麦格雷格上校的分析。
You have on the one hand Trump adopting the bellicose language, making these statements that have no bearing on reality, things that he rejected 120 days ago, 180 days ago. He wouldn't have said any of them. Now he's saying them, essentially repeating this sort of neocon globalist narrative about Russia. He's also saying he wants to get out of Germany. He wants to withdraw forces from Germany. Well, if you're a German and you say, well, the Americans want to get out.
Do you think he's serious about that? I just can't imagine it. You think he's serious?
Look, one of the things in private conversation with him in November of 2020, he made it abundantly clear that he was deadly serious. And that wasn't the first time. He has long felt that the Europeans should be their own first responders. President Trump is not a fool. He understands, just as Eisenhower did in the 1950s, there will be no new Normandy invasion. It's not going to happen. We're not coming back with millions of troops. We can't do it. The technology of warfare has changed. And if we're going to send anything to anybody that's meaningful, it has to go by sea. And today, any convoy that crosses the Atlantic or the Pacific with large quantities of troops and materiel is going to be identified and ultimately destroyed, either by ground-based or air-launched precision missile strikes or by submarines. So it's over. And he knows it's over. The Europeans are in denial. They don't want to accept that, but they've got to come to terms with it.
I'm asking this because, the U.S. strategy of having military bases all around the world, to me, doesn't seem to be changing, because taking the forces out of Germany would be huge, because a lot of the US command, also AFRICOM and so on, is stationed in Germany, right? It would be much easier to start, let's say, in Finland and Sweden, which only last year got base agreements with the US, right? He could cancel those, but those are 15 and 17 US bases each. That's over 30 new bases in the Nordics. That would be much easier to cancel, but I don't hear any of that talk.
No, and you're right. First of all, and this is very important to understand, most Europeans cannot grasp this, and they need to get this. There is no strategy. None. The only thing that people want to do in Washington is to hold on to what exists. In other words, they are clinging tenaciously to the status quo, even though everybody privately knows we can't afford it. We can't maintain it. We can't sustain it. It's kind of funny. People talk about $1 trillion defense budget, but at the same time, everybody sees what's happening in Japan and the collapse of the bond market. That's going to happen here. We're at roughly 4.5% on 10-year treasuries. Each month, this goes up a few points. At some point, it's going to rise quickly in a way that we cannot possibly imagine today, but it will, because we no longer have control. You can cut the interest rates, and the yield for Treasury bonds goes up anyway, because people don't want to invest in us. We have been selling 2-year Treasuries. Even that is now going to become a problem. Nobody wants to buy the 30 years anymore. And now we have the Japanese who've told us, look, we're in a lot of trouble. No hard feelings, but we're going to dump your treasuries. We're going to get rid of them. They're not worth anything. The Chinese are going to do it. And they are the last ones. People don't understand this. Chinese don't want to become the reserve currency. They're very happy to let us do it. They always have been. This is another myth, the evil China that wants to conquer the world and rule Asia. You know, if the Chinese truly wanted to rule Asia, there's an organization, it's called Tokyo. They'd have something to say about it. It's not going to happen. And the Vietnamese would never tolerate it either. And the last time the Chinese challenged the Vietnamese, that was a very unsatisfactory outcome. Look, we're living on Fantasy Island in Washington. Washington, D.C. is Fantasy Island. We can't afford any of it. We've spent ourselves into oblivion. We're headed into a severe recession that could become a depression, particularly if we end up in a war in the Middle East, which we haven't talked about. That would trigger catastrophe over here. We continue to lose control of industries. We just sold the last semblance of national power in the form of United States Steel to Japan. I mean, nobody that I knew when I was living in the 50s and 60s, if I told them the Japanese are going to buy U.S. steel, people would say it's impossible. You've lost your mind. We are in bad shape, Pascal. That's the truth.
So is the United States, pretending to be a jet fighter when it's actually more of a very big hot air balloon, and something's going to give at some point?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody should understand something. When did the British leave India? The British left India 1947, 1948, when the debt to GDP ratio in Great Britain was 240%. Now remember, if you go back to the 30s and you look at the British General Staff Journal and the discussions that were held with politicians, what was the number one priority for the British? Was it defending France against the Germans? No, it was the empire, and it was India. And in fact, there was tremendous resistance to what Churchill wanted to do because they kept pointing to Stalin and the Soviets and say, that's the real enemy. What are you doing? We're not going to benefit from destroying the Nazi regime if it's replaced by the Soviets. Well, we all know the rest of the story. In the meantime, everything that they insisted they were fighting for, what happened to it? It went away. When things get bad here, the first thing we will do is cut forces overseas and bring them home. It's much cheaper to maintain the forces here than it is to maintain them overseas.
I mean, honestly, I would hope for this to happen, because that would, in my view, de-escalate a lot of situations. Maybe not everywhere. The one place that will always try to intervene as much as it can politically to prevent that from happening is Israel. What do you think is Israel's role in the let's say the scaling back of the U.S. empire?
Well, keep in mind, before we leave the topic of troop withdrawals, that the Washington just announced, the Trump administration, their intention to withdraw 5,000 troops from the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
Now, we've kept all these forces in Korea and Japan because of the imminent threat from China. All of a sudden, we say, well, we don't need to do that. The problem is, what I'm trying to get across is there is no strategy. First of all, before you withdraw troops, you sit down with your allies and you come up with a plan to withdraw. You be honest and straightforward and say, look, we can't stay here in numbers we have. We have to cut costs. We're going to have to make withdrawals. And you work it out. You should work it out with the Germans, with the Italians. You mentioned the Swedes and the Finns that have apparently bet the farm on the arrival of U.S. forces, which is sheer lunacy. But the point is, I don't see any strategy. No one is in Tokyo or Seoul and saying, look, we want to coordinate these withdrawals. We're just going to start leaving. And we're going to try and do it in the dead of night.
Indeed, the thing is, the Japanese and the Koreans, just like the Germans and the Europeans in general, they try to do the opposite. They cling to the Americans, right? They don't want to let them go. And the Korean situation is interesting because there's a joint staff agreement. In fact, if ever North Korea crosses the 38th parallel, the person in charge, the general in charge of both of U.S. and Korean forces would be a U.S. general. The U.S. general would command the Korean forces as well. And that agreement is still in place. I know that the U.S. and Korea were talking about changing that, but it's still in place at the moment. They're just so tightly intertwined, especially over here in Asia.
Well, things are changing. In my book, Breaking the Phalanx, I recommended in 1997, when that book came out, that a Korean four-star should command all of the forces on the peninsula, not an American. We're down to roughly 23,000 in the Army and another 6,000 or so Navy and Air Force. It's a very small contingent. We are no longer on the border between the two Koreas. The South Korean military is excellent. It's more than adequate to defend itself. And to be frank with you, the majority of anybody that you talk to that has any sort of understanding strategically of the region does not expect North Korea to attack South Korea. In fact, they're developing very good rapport with Beijing, and the last thing that Beijing wants is a war on the Korean Peninsula.
And North Korea, last year, Kim Jong-un said, we know where our southern border is. We don't want the south. We know where the border is. They actually kind of renounced their claim to South Korea.
But the thing is, we need to talk to them. Because I can tell you that in North Korea, if they see a sudden evacuation of U.S. forces from South Korea, they'll believe that a nuclear strike by the United States against them is imminent. Now, that may seem strange to you and me, but you have to understand the North Korean mentality that has evolved there over many decades. So what you want is some sort of agreement in place that gradually disengages us in a way that is very understandable, very obvious, and widely monitored by both North and South. You need to talk to the president of China. He has a stake in all of this. You need to talk to Tokyo. Let me stop for a minute and give you an example of what I'm talking about. When Nixon went to China with Kissinger, after they had had their discussions and signed their agreements and so forth, Deng Xiaoping turned to Kissinger and he said, have you been to Tokyo? Have you told the Japanese what you're doing? Believe it or not, the answer was no. Deng Xiaoping said, you should talk to the Japanese. We know them very well. They have an interest in what is happening, and you should talk to them, keep them informed, keep them on board. We, China, want good relations with the Japanese. So my point is, this is pure American stupidity. Okay, we are governed by arrogance and ignorance. We are effusive in praise for ourselves. We see ourselves in unrealistic ways. All you have to do is listen to President Trump. If they're not going to do what I say, if they're not going to come together, well, then I'm not going to have anything to do with this. We'll walk away. Who the hell does he think he is? Who does he think he's dealing with? We have no true sense of a balance regarding who we are and who others are. And this is dangerous. And it's very dangerous for the Europeans. The bad news is it sounds like Merz, Macron, and Starmer have contracted a similar disease. They don't realize what they're dealing with. I can't imagine Palmerston in England or Disraeli or Gladstone or anybody else treating the Russians with the same kind of disregard and contempt. They understand very well that Russia may be many things, but Russia is a great power, and it has enormous influence. You don't treat it badly, but we do. We treat other countries badly, and we think everyone should bow down to us. So I just want to get that across before we go into the Middle East, because these are things Europeans must understand about us. Keep in mind, I love my country, and I think Americans have many fine attributes, but we're talking about a government, not the American people. We're talking about a government with an unrealistic view of itself and the rest of the world. Remember, it's Fantasy Island. Nobody knows. Well, I mentioned the Cossack Rebellion. If you mention that on the Hill, people look at you and say, what? Oh, you mean these funny guys that wear funny hats and ride horses? I mean, that's the level of ignorance. This country is a planet on its own, literally. Europeans need to understand that, and they need to get a hold of people like Rubio and the State Department and others and say, look, talk to us. What are you really doing? Nobody really knows. You know, Trump has just made a number of contradictory statements, reversed himself completely, 180-degree turns from where he was a couple of months ago. And everybody acts like, well, that's no big deal. It's a very big deal. We need to get on board with the rest of the world.
No, you're right. And you know, the scary thing is that we tend to think that policies and so on are made in boardrooms, meeting rooms, and delivered over, and plans and generals and so on. But we now understand, no, it's WhatsApp chat groups, and it's ad hoc, and it deals with what the Bay throws at them, especially these pronouncements by Mr. Trump. They're made at the whim of his fingers, right? And they have like market impact, they have geopolitical impact, and that's something the rest of the world just needs to deal with.
好，以上就是麦格雷格上校的精彩观点。他直言不讳地指出，今天的华盛顿其实没有清晰的长远战略，只是在靠着惯性维持一个日落西山的霸权。他用幻想岛形容美国决策层，认为他们对自己的实力面临的挑战，还有国际局势的变化，判断都错得离谱。麦格雷格还特别提醒，美国这种傲慢又缺乏现实感的政策，除了让自己陷入困境，也可能会拖累他的盟友，尤其是欧洲国家。他对美国军事部署的不可持续性，还有国内深层矛盾的剖析也洞若观火。好，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家的收看，我们下次再见。